Don't know how many of you are news junkies. I don't know that I am nearly as much as I used to be, but I caught a little bit this week. There was multiple stories that were kind of bouncing around about multiple different figures who the word impeachment has come up with regard to Supreme Court Justice, the President of the United States. And it got me thinking about what does impeachment mean? And, we probably all, not everybody, I should say. There's definitely some Gen Zers in here who may not totally remember President Clinton when he got impeached. There's baby boomers in the room who definitely would remember, and I don't really remember this, when President Nixon was impeached. I don't think any of us remember when President Johnson was impeached, because now we're going back to the Civil War. But you know that there is a process of impeachment that happens. And what is it? It's a verb. It means to overturn the established procedures previously enacted by legislative or democratic action. What a cool definition that is, huh? I mean, take a look at that. So basically what you've got is you have something that has been put into place. Maybe it is an elected official. And that official, he's elected, right? That means that there was a body that said, this is what we want. We want this person to lead us. Or maybe it's an idea. We want this idea to be something that governs us going forward. And it can be done by, a group that says, like a republic, okay, we're going to pick our leaders and we're going to let them go vote on our behalf in a Congress, and they can make up the law or appoint the ambassador or the judge or whatever. Or it's a directly democratic thing where we all go to a ballot box and we check off what we want. And we say, this is how it's going to be. But then something happens. In the case of a president, it's high crimes and misdemeanors. Something happens where that leadership or that authority that is associated with that person or that idea, it becomes questioned. And now a group of people come back and say, we want to undo the power that was bestowed to this person, to this idea, to this concept. We want to undo that and take that away. And so that's what it means to impeach. Got it? Make sense? All kind of jive with kind of what you previously thought? Now, there are some things that you would say are unimpeachable. Doesn't matter. They get into power. Maybe they're a dictator. Maybe they become a dictator after they seize power. But they arrive, or the idea arrives at a place where you say, not this one. It doesn't matter how unpopular this idea or this person might become. They have an unimpeachable position, and they cannot be removed, no matter the circumstances, from that perch that they're sitting on. Make sense? Unimpeachable. Tonight, what we're really going to be talking about is unimpeachable absolutes. But we're going to kind of talk about it via something else that's kind of happening in our day and age. I'm talking about different things, historically. I am a child of the 80s. And when I was a kid, this was my president. Well, yes, he was Ronald Reagan. And, some of you in the room are too young to remember what that was like. It was a great time to be alive. It was like happy days had come back. There was this wave of sort of Americana nostalgia that came back. It was just this weird kind of thing in the 80s that really, the 70s were just sort of like this strange sort of historical, like the country couldn't figure out what it was, but it knew what it was in the 60s. And the 80s was kind of like a bounce the other direction from the 60s. And nowhere was that more obvious than what took place with Ronnie's wife, Nancy. Nancy Reagan, who, in addition to being really keen in the astrology, was also the first lady of the United States. And she, as the first lady, she quarterbacked an initiative that became huge in our culture. It was called Just Say No. And every kid who was a product of the 80s will probably remember that great historical moment in our nation's, fabric and fiber when Nancy Reagan went on Different Strokes and appeared with Willis and Arnold. It was a huge moment for the Republic of the United States of America. And they really wanted to drill the message home to this next generation of kids coming up. Don't do like the 60s. Just say no to drugs. Drugs are evil. Drugs are wrong. Drugs are the boogeyman. Drugs will derail you. And Willis got this message better than anybody. For those of you who remember the 80s, you know that is not the case at all. But, this was the big deal, man. She went all over the place. She was at sporting events, and she was on TV shows, and she was everywhere. And it was drilled into us over and over and over again. Just say no. And, it was in our television. It was in all just everywhere. And, of course, what we were taught, at least at Lyman Gilmore Intermediate School, where I was, getting my education about how evil drugs were, we were taught that there was kind of this progression that we needed to be mindful of and stay away from, that there were the big, scary drugs like we saw on Miami Vice, like cocaine, and we were supposed to really stay away from it, but we didn't have to worry so much about cocaine because that would be a drug that we would get to later. The drug that we really needed to worry about was marijuana. And, we didn't even know what we were singing about when we sang Puff the Magic Dragon. But, it was, surprise, this was the gateway drug that would lead us down, the path to desolation. If we puffed up, and there was, all kinds of cool words for it, right? I mean, I'm talking about Puff the Magic Dragon, right? There was pot, there was weed, there was dope. There was, what are some of the other ones that are out there? Mary Jane's a 60s reference, 70s stuff. But we had all of these, great things that were supposed to, supposed to scare us away from token up, baby, And of course we had the great, movies and stuff like The Big Lebowski and stuff, that, were out there, dude, there was all kinds of that stuff in culture, but this was the big thing. Be afraid of it. Stay away from it. It's evil. It's wrong. And this was a big piece of this, that we were taught not only just to say no to it, but we were taught specifically by authority. We were taught by authority that this was wrong. It came from our politicians. It came from law enforcement. And it came from medical professionals that this was bad and wrong. And even, I dare say, immoral. And that was absolute. That was even an unimpeachable absolute. Drugs are bad, drugs are wrong. Now, of course, we flash forward to today. Today, we have a rapidly changing view of cannabis. We don't even call it marijuana anymore. It's now cannabis, right? And, we talked about it a little bit at lunch today, and I was deeply impressed with how knowledgeable your staff at Discover Church is about these things. I mean, it's not that they partake of it at all, but just, but the interesting thing to me was, both of our staff guys, Jeremy and Tyler, are both 2 generations away from mine. They didn't grow up with Ronald Reagan and Generation X. They're both Generation Z. And what their culture, what their generation perceives about this substance is very different than what my generation was taught to think about it. And it's been an interesting thing because, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to touch that. Back up. No, the wrong way. There we go. What we're seeing today with, CBD and the cannabis and all that sort of stuff is, in a lot of cases, just looking up some of the things that are being discovered about it, is all kinds of medical, advancement that's being, sort of uncovered. When you, especially in the state of Oklahoma, when you think about it in the context kind of which it's been presented sort of as a contrast to opioids, I mean, it's like, hello, right? And the interesting thing about opioids is where did those come from? Those oftentimes were drugs that were prescribed by medical professionals. And then, you get them in a wide variety of ways afterwards, but it was authority that said, here, take this. This will be good for you. This will make things better. And, this, again, is something, I just looking around the room, I see many, many people that I know who are directly connected to people that have had real difficulties from opioid drugs. And those opioids that were administered or recommended by those people that we have as a society said we should trust. These are people that are looking out for our best interest. Only now we've begun to recognize that those drugs are probably more detrimental than they are beneficial. And people are looking at cannabis now, and when I say people, I mean authorities. I mean, obviously politicians, because it's now legal in the great red state of Oklahoma, right? From a medical perspective. It's legal in 31 states of our 50 in the United States. It's not just our politicians that are saying it's okay. It's our law enforcement that's saying it's okay. And it's not just that. It's oftentimes it's our medical professionals that are saying it's okay. So what happened? What changed? Was it our science got better? Was it our perceptions got better? Was it we looked at the alternatives and we saw, man, how bad things were with opioids, and we said, you know what, this may have some issues, but these have got so many more issues over here, let's get rid of these and instead go with this way? It's really hard to say, and for me to stand up here and definitively say, just, this is the way it is, but it'd just be one guy's interpretation and one guy's judgment call. I am not God, I can't speak for him, but all I can do is sort of say, it's probably all of the above. Here's the thing that's interesting to me, is the shift in the moral judgment, the shift in the unimpeachableness of, in this case, cannabis, which, as I set up at the very beginning of this thing, is, I think, a nice example for us to look at when we're thinking about anything that we have been conditioned to think about one way, and then culture has started blowing a different direction and has presented us a pretty good, pretty sound, pretty solid argument that we look at, and not only do we feel like, gosh, that sounds better, that feels better, but as we engage our critical reasoning skills, we begin to think that's better. And how easy is it for Generation Z, or for millennials, or for Generation X, or for baby boomers, or even the greatest generation, how easy is it for any of us to say, well, if we could have been wrong about something like that, how do we know that we're not wrong about what we think about God? Right? Right? And as I said at the very beginning week of this series, when I start talking about some of the Christian leaders, that have made these decisions recently to say, I don't know that I believe anymore. I think this is exactly the kind of slippery slope that they got on. That they had stood in places just like I'm standing right now and had said, this is the way it is. This is the unimpeachable, absolute truth. And then they looked around and said, now every place else, though, that I thought in my life I had unimpeachable truth to say, it's like this or it's like that. Those things have moved. They've become moving targets. And if they're moving targets, what's to say this faith thing, this Christianity thing, isn't one too? What's to say that? Now, you know what's interesting? I'm going to read to you some passages of Scripture. I'm going to read them to you from the 5th chapter of the book of Matthew. And, when I teach you, there's about 4 different biblical translations or versions that I personally use when I prepare a message. I go through them, I look, and I think, which verbiage do I think is the most communicative for our group? Sometimes I use the Message, sometimes I use the New Living Translation, sometimes I use New American Standard, occasionally I'll use the ESV, but the majority of the time, what I present to you are texts from the New International Version. You know what's interesting? Is the NIV Bible that I have, it's like my preaching Bible. I don't have it tonight because it was too heavy with the backpack, but it's the big, thick one that you've seen me use sometimes. It's actually, I've had it recovered over the years. It's in big black leather, and when I want to feel really authoritative, if I shake it like this, it gives great power and authority, and actually kind of hurts my triceps, but that's one of the problems. That Bible was published in 1981. And that Bible says things in a masculine pronoun nature. When I pull out my much lighter Gateway Bible on this thing and pull it to the NIV, all of those masculine pronouns are gone. Now they're gender neutral pronouns. The Bible's changed. And so it was really funny. So I started writing my slides today, and I was copying out of my big preaching Bible, and then I flipped over a couple passages, and I didn't want to, leave my finger in it, so I pulled it up on, the phone to go back, and the wording was all different. And I thought, well, here you go, the very thing we're talking about, right? The scriptures have changed. Well, have they? So let's dig in, because I think the reality is there's no greater tension than the movement of absolutes. I think the one thing that gives us a sense of faith about God, about our spiritual walk, is when we can say, at least that should be unimpeachable. At least that should be unmovable. Well, what do we do when Jesus says, hey, you've heard it was one way, but actually, let me tell you something else, because that's what's all about going on in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' great sermon that he gave to the masses. It was the most famous sermon probably ever delivered. And the crowd was a mixed crowd that was there. There were people there that were religious Jewish Sanhedrin-type leaders, and there were people there that were washed-out peasants who had been told back in rabbinical school, you don't belong here, get out. There were men that fit that bill. There were women who weren't even allowed to read and go to school and all that sort of stuff. And Jesus was teaching all of them. And Jesus said, I'm going to share with you 3 or 4 of these. They're about the great subject matters of any era. This one was about murder. Jesus said, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now, I could talk to you for 35 minutes about murder, but what I really want to talk to you about was Jesus saying, you guys are here listening to me because you have spiritual questions. This is not your first rodeo, though, looking for spiritual answers. Everybody here in this crowd of people have listened to other experts tell you before what the religion says. And you've heard consistently from them about murder. But I'm here to tell you something different. And what I'm going to tell you about here is you've looked at it and you've developed a law. You've developed a pattern. You've developed something that's acceptable, a law, a consistency, a kind of thing that you would say should not be impeached. And I'm going to tell you, let's impeach it. Let's impeach it. I'm going to give you something else to think about. This was radical. It was radical. Now, I don't know how many times you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount. If you've ever been in a duck blind with Lance Bradshaw, you've heard the Sermon on the Mount 15 times. But the rest of us, I don't know how many times you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount, but I don't know if you've ever stopped and realized what Jesus was doing. Jesus was impeaching the very spiritual, biblical, scriptural principles that these people had adhered to as a people group, this Jewish people, for generations. He was impeaching it. Then he continues on. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Does it again. You guys know this law. You know how it works. You know how this whole system plays out. Matter of fact, you guys have figured out how to do your whole lives kind of around this system. And all the gals are sitting there going, yeah, preach it, Jesus, preach it. As he's saying all this. And he says, let me tell you what. This is actually how it works. Again, same sort of deal. He keeps going. He says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He keeps going. Now, this was really huge to the Jewish people. I've taught you several times at Discover, multiple times at Discover. I've taught you enough about Jewish history for you to know that people group was constantly beat up on by their neighbors. They were constantly dragged through the mud. They had lots of enemies who beat up on them frequently for as long as they were a nation. Constantly. So the whole idea of saying know who your friend is and know who your enemy is was really important to them from a protective protective perspective. But Jesus comes and says, love those guys. Love them. I mean, this is radically different stuff. And the thing that I hope that you see constantly in all of this is Jesus is upending the system. Jesus is. Jesus is saying, you've heard it said this way, but I tell you it's this way. Jesus is claiming authority here. And this would be the beginning of a hot potato between those religious leaders. This was the beginning of their big fight with him over where do you get the authority to tell us this stuff? We don't even know where you went to rabbinical school. Matter of fact, we think you're from Nazareth. We know that no good rabbis come from Nazareth. What's the deal here? And they would go back and forth with each other over the authority that Jesus just sort of radiated and Jesus communicated. Notice in none of that stuff did Jesus ever say, let me tell you, I studied at the Academy of Hillel, the great rabbi, and because of the education that he gave me, I claim the ability to now tell you this is the way it is. He didn't say any of that. He just says, you've heard it always said this way, I tell you it's this way. So there is tremendous authority that Jesus is just invoking. And of course, he knew where his authority came from. Not some teacher, not some school. It came from the Father. And he was saying, here is how it is. And this is the big issue. Now, lest you think that Jesus was saying, I'm coming in to breathe a fresh new spirit, right? And a fresh new thing that contradicts everything that's gone before. Jesus actually started off this whole passage this way. And this verse came first, but I want to share it with you second. He said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. What Jesus was saying when he talked to all of these people is, the absolute is not the law. It's not the stuff that you guys are trying to say, here's the rule book for how I live. The absolute is me, Jesus. I am the absolute. And I will be the one that fulfills this stuff. You can't. You can't live well enough to fulfill the law. I'll take care of that for you. I will do that. And I will be the one who ultimately pays the price that says the law is now fulfilled for everybody. And Jesus in that moment is establishing himself as the tension between what we think and what we feel. He is the bridge that holds it together. And when we have these things that we face in our life, whether it's what we think about murder or sex or hating our brother, or whether it's what we think about the issues that we're struggling with today. Tonight, I mentioned marijuana. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about immigration. A couple weeks from now, we're going to talk a little bit about homosexuality. You know, some of these issues that, man, we kind of really wrestle with in this day and age and think, man, you know, I don't want to be on the wrong side of this. We don't have to choose a side of an issue. What we have to choose is to be with Jesus. And the reason for that is because Jesus is the unimpeachable absolute in and of himself. And it's not the way that he interpreted the law to say, well, you know, you were thinking it was this, but you're wrong, it's this. It is the character of Jesus. In every one of those three examples that you saw, Jesus actually said, you've been doing your law and you've had it at a pretty high bar, but I'm going to tell you what, we're going to take that bar and we're going to shove it even higher. If they would get beyond him saying, I'm changing the ground rules, and if they would have actually listened to what he was saying about the rules, they would have been freaked out in a different way. They were mad at him going, who are you to tell us we were wrong? But if they would have gotten past that and started listening to what he was actually saying, they would have said, whoa, he just shoved the bar insanely high. How in the world am I supposed to do that? I mean, especially the dudes that were sitting there thinking, man, I look at good-looking women all the time. I go, yeah, and stuff. And now that's like adultery? What? And those guys over there, they're jerks to me. I hate them. And you're telling me I'm in danger of hellfire for that? What? I mean, this is the deal. Jesus in his character, which is all about love and all about generosity and all about consistency. It's about kindness. It's about being, peace-giving. We go through and we look at the fruit of the Spirit. Those things are the character of Christ, and those are the things that are unimpeachable. The book of Hebrews says this, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. This is the thing for us. It's not about us going and saying, man, my world is rocked. Because when I was a kid, pot was wrong, and now as an adult, CBD is good. So if that's the case, what else could possibly change? Oh man, what does that mean for God? How in the world can I do this? Things change. Things change all the time. That's part of the nature of stuff. That's part of the nature of God's creation. He makes things, Noah got his first tooth today. Actually, it's been coming for a while, hasn't it, Mom? Yeah, she noticed it today, right? Someday Noah's teeth are going to fall out as an old man. That's just the circle of life. Sing the song, guys. No, just kidding. Just kidding. That's just the way God made things. That's what happens. Change. It comes. But Jesus promises in that ever-changingness, I will always be there and I will be consistent in my character. That's not going to change. But what I love is the beginning of that verse. This is not telling you guys to remember me, okay? I'm not the leader that spoke the word of God to you. What this is saying, you think back to, maybe it's your grandmother, or maybe it's an aunt or an uncle, maybe it was a school teacher, maybe it was somebody, that wasn't related to you, maybe it was, it doesn't matter, but surely you can think of people who, they weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but you know what? They stuck with Jesus. They tried with their life, no matter what change came their way, whether it was good or bad, to live their life according to the character traits of God. They lived out trying to achieve those fruits of the Spirit. And the life that they led, there were still difficulties, but at the end of the day, as I consider their outcome, I want what they had. I want the peace that they were able to find even when the boat started rocking. That's what I want. And they got that, not by sticking their head in the sand and pretending like the world wasn't changing around them. They got that by saying, no matter what change comes, I'm going to keep on, keeping on, being like Jesus. I'm going to love my neighbor and my enemy. I'm going to try to honor my spouse, my loved one. I'm going to do my very level best to keep Jesus first in my life. Let him be my God, be my Savior, be my Lord. And in that, the life that they experienced actually was a life of joy. And that joy stayed no matter how much quicksand moved around them. Consider that, because this is the end of that verse. He's the same. He's the same God today that he was yesterday, and he'll be the same God tomorrow that he is today. That character will be there no matter what. Would you pray with me?